Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Rudine, the Director of Donor Engagement for the chapter. Thank you for joining me for another ALS Community Chats. Today, we have some special guests. Of course, you all probably know Lance Christian, our Executive Director. We also have Ian McHone here, who's a new board member with the chapter. When he introduces himself, he can update us on how long, because I don't remember. But they were both, Lance and Ian, were part of our ALS Association's virtual advocacy conference this week and last week, including doing some virtual public policy priority asks on Tuesday. So they have a lot to share about their experiences and what this year's public policy priorities are. I'm going to be facilitating this conversation, but anyone can ask questions and we'll try and answer them here. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Lance, to introduce yourself, and then Ian, feel free to introduce yourself as well.
Great. Well, hi, I'm Lance Christian. I'm the Executive Director of the Oregon and Southwest Washington chapter, and I've been with the ALS Association a little over 18 years. So and been part of many public policy conferences and advocacy delegations, but it's one of my favorite things to do.
I'm Ian McHone. I live here in Happy Valley, Oregon. I came on the board in January of this year, so it's a pretty new experience to me. I was diagnosed with ALS in October of 18 after kind of first experiencing symptoms in the spring of that year. So been living with it now for 3 years, and yeah, just happy to be here and happy to have the opportunity to share with you today a few things that happened this week.
All right, thanks, Ian and Lance. Lance, as you said, you've been with the organization for 18 years, so you have a wealth of experience with public policy and all of those pieces. And I know we've had some recent big wins in policy. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what you've seen, kind of the evolution of some of these priorities, and also, some of the wins that have been brought about thanks to your advocacy and a lot of other people living with ALS over the years.
Sure. For the ALS Association, the pillars of our efforts are funding research to find treatments and cures, the care services to help people here in our local communities. But the other pillar is public policy advocacy, and that is influencing government and public policy to benefit ALS research and services for people with ALS. And with my long tenure, I've seen some amazing things happen. Things that really give special support for people living with ALS. Everything from the 24-month Medicare waiver that sort of eliminated a waiting period for people with ALS to get access to Medicare, a long effort that we were part of and initiated to get service-connected veterans benefits for people living with ALS. There's been times when we've had to pick up the baton and fight for people to have access to things like complex rehab technology for power wheelchairs and for respiratory equipment. And even most recently, just this last year, being part of a long-term effort that resulted in the elimination of the 5-month waiting period for Social Security disability benefits when people with ALS apply. And because people, as we all know, we hope for slow progression, but most people with ALS don't have time to wait around to get resources. And so those are big wins. But then on top of that, there's just been some amazing increases in funding for ALS research over time.
Thanks, Lance. And the elimination of the 5-month waiting period for Social Security disability insurance just happened. Was that in December or January?
December of last year, and just really went into effect right away. And we've already seen immediate results when people now applying for disability, they get the access to funds and their Medicare right away, and it makes a big difference.
Yeah, thank you. For this year, there are a whole bunch of public policy priorities, and that's also on our website. But I was hoping you could highlight a few, Lance, that you find most important and that you all discussed over this last virtual advocacy conference.
You bet. Well, so there's a couple of realms in which our asks or our advocacy fall into. And some of them are legislation that will move the needle to provide support or resources or benefits for people with ALS or to access healthcare. But a big one is funding and dollars for particularly for research funding. The ALS Association is the largest nonprofit funder of ALS research in the world. And each year it's been around $19 to $21 million that we all collectively pull together to fund for novel research ideas. Proud to say our chapter over the last 8 or 9, 10 years have provided an additional 1.1 million directly into that effort through all of the support we get. But that's still a fraction of what is needed. And so the largest single funder of ALS research in the world is the federal government. And that doesn't happen unless we are up on Capitol Hill making the case that there's a need to support that research. And over time, we've seen those dollars grow. In the last decade, there was a doubling of the NIH budget, and as well as great increases in ALS research funding. So it doesn't all come from one pot or go to one place. And so there's multiple programs that require constant advocacy to make sure these things get into the appropriations bills that Congress passes each year. And right now, they're working on the bills that will fund fiscal year 22. And so right now we're arguing for the funds that should fall into next year. But in particular, the things that we were looking at for appropriations, and we actually did some of that work earlier in the year because a lot of the appropriation bills move in sort of the March timeframe. And so we had a whole other round of meetings earlier in the year with our congressional delegation and the Southwest Washington congressional delegation. And in particular, we were asking for increase in NIH funding and to increase the NIH funding for ALS research to at least $130 million and asking for 20 million more for this year. Also, another research program that gets a lot of ALS research funding, believe it or not, is for the ALS research program at the Department of Defense. And this year we were asking Congress to provide $60 million for that program, $20 million increase over last fiscal year. And this is a program that's had a big local effect because one of the recipients of that Department of Defense research funding has been Joe Beckman's lab at Oregon State University working on copper ATSM. And a new thing for us this year has been asking for increased funding for $50 million for the Orphan Products Grants Program. ALS is lives in a category of disease that have less than 200,000 people affected called orphan diseases. And this would be a fund in the FDA to help promote clinical trials and to fund clinical trials. And we know there's a greater need for clinical trials in ALS. Continued funding as well. We asked for $10 million for the National ALS Registry and Biorepository. And while they're counting numbers, this is also one of the areas where research is being done to look at environmental factors that are related to ALS. And that funding, is sort of been going for a while, but needs to continue because it's sort of a pipeline. It's like you put water in a pipe, and if you don't keep pushing more water into it, it stops moving. So to keep the good knowledge flowing, we need to continue funding. And then a new ask for us as well. It was a small one in federal terms, which is $1 million for the National Academy of Sciences to develop a plan and policy recommendations for what can be done by the government and all stakeholders to make ALS a livable or chronic disease versus a terminal disease. And the idea behind that is to try to have an overall master strategy for all these different agencies and which areas they should work on to bring treatments forward. And those are sort of the fiscal funding things that we advocate for. And, Congress changes and members come and members go. This year we have a new member in Eastern and Southern Oregon who doesn't know anything about ALS. So we have to keep presenting information and educate them about the disease. Many of our legislators have a long-term and they've learned about ALS or they have a personal connection. For these appropriations, I'm proud to say that the majority of our delegation signed on to what's called a Dear Colleague letter. And basically, in Congress, a Dear Colleague letter is around appropriations about sort of, hey, we want to spend money on this. And if a member will sort of submit a Dear Colleague letter to all their peers in Congress to say, hey, we want to support these initiatives. Do you support them too? And the idea is if you get enough signatures that show enough members really support it, then it carries weight to get into the final budget. And I'm really proud to say that the majority of the Oregon delegation and Southwest Washington delegation signed on to those letters. Both Oregon senators signed the Senate Dear Colleague letter, as did the Washington senators. In Southwest Washington, Representative Jamie Herrera Butler signed on to that Dear Colleague letter. And in Oregon, Representatives Blumenauer, Bonamici, and DeFazio signed on to that letter. So still not quite all, but the majority of the delegation. And so the idea is pile on, and when everybody knows they believe in it, then it just carries forward into the fiscal spending. So I know it's sort of how the sausage is made, but if we don't keep this sort of in the forefront of these legislators' minds, it falls off the track. So it's a great effort. But there's so many other things to do, and there's other actual legislation that we're trying to get passed.
Thanks, Lance. And, as you were saying, it's so important to keep putting pressure on representatives. And, we have an advocacy center. If you go to alsoregon.org/advocacy, and I'll put that in the comments, there's a lot of ways people can ask your representatives to sign things like Dear Colleague letters and things like that. And then, of course, it's so important that people like Ian are here who are living with ALS and who are sharing their story and who are, involved with these ALS advocacy priorities. So, Ian, if you don't mind, I'd love to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about, it's your first time attending the advocacy conference and the virtual Hill Day. And I don't know if you have experience with public policy in the past, Ian, but if you could share a little bit about your experiences with this, and then also a little bit about the policy priorities, some of the legislative asks that you are involved in as well.
Oh, thank you. No, I do not have any experience in it per se. And I was approached by the chapter if I would be willing to participate this year, and it wasn't really something I had ever considered before. And I appreciate the opportunity. It was enlightening. I learned a lot. And like Lance just referenced, we have to stay in front of these people constantly. And I mean, there's hundreds of groups, at their door every day, advocating for themselves. And if we're not doing it too, we're just going to get left behind, and it is something we can't do. So I appreciated the opportunity. Tuesday was a busy day. We met with most of our representatives and senators from Oregon and Southwest Washington. Most of our meetings were with their staff, although Representative Bonamici did take some time, and actually a decent amount of time to talk with us and listen to what we had to say. So that was much appreciated, and it was nice. So there was 3 specific pieces of legislation that we talked about in our meetings. The first one was the Promising Pathway Act, which is a bill to create provisional approval pathways at the FDA for drugs. As most people with the disease are aware, there's only 2 drugs that are FDA approved for ALS. Neither of them are cures or by any means. They're just hopefully to extend life, and their ability to do that is somewhat limited. But they have been approved, and I take both of them, but there's not a lot out there. So again, creating pathways to get things provisional approval. So maybe they haven't gone through the full trial process, which can take anywhere from 5 to 10 years, which unfortunately, the average person with ALS has somewhere between 2 and 5 years to live. So we can't wait for things to run the gamut and go the normal course. So this bill was about, again, creating provisional approvals for things that have shown that they can be safe, but yet still going through the trial process. And it's not specific to ALS, but it's something that obviously with the limited amount of drugs that are approved, we were pushing for that. So the second piece was one that I kind of personally talked about quite a bit in our meetings, was the accelerated or access for critical therapies for ALS, or the ACT for ALS Act. And this is more of a funding vehicle at different aspects in the government, both the FDA, Health and Human Services, of creating funding mechanisms for different types of things. So either approval for drugs or access to drugs that may be in clinical trial, but yet people with ALS aren't able to maybe participate in that trial due to their duration with the disease, which can exclude you from trials, maybe just sheer access. There's only limited spots available, and there's only so much research that's going on. So I've seen numbers that maybe there's only 1,000 participants in ALS trials at any given time, and there's 30,000 people roughly in the United States living with the disease. So that's not a lot. So again, creating the access so that people outside of the trial can get access to these drugs, and again, creating grants between the public sector and private pharmacies as far as more research. So this was a little bigger reach in that funding is a huge component of it, and but I do think it was generally received by a fair amount of the people that we met with, and again, expressing the need that we don't have time to wait through this, so we need to rethink the models as they are today and move forward and try to advocate change. And this was kind of specifically for ALS, but it also was for other rare neurodegenerative diseases as well. So, but the primary focus of it was ALS. And then the last piece we talked about, and I got to read this one now. It's a neat acronym, but getting it right is creating opportunities now for necessary and effective care technologies, or the CONNECT Act. And in a nutshell, this was extending the use of telehealth past COVID. There was some exemptions with Medicare as far as allowing telehealth because of COVID, and this act would continue that on past this. People with ALS have significant mobility issues, transportation issues. They don't necessarily live in urban centers where that healthcare facility is close to them. But as we mentioned in our meetings with these Congress people, you could live a mile away, and it could be just as difficult to get there as living hundreds of miles away. So access is just a big issue. So, and again, being able to do these things virtually, just as we are today, I think in the last 12 to 15 months have enlightened everybody that we can, if we're willing to rethink how we do our business, healthcare, meetings with friends, whatever it might be, that there's ways around it. And this was a big push to just, again, continue the provisions that were made through COVID. And I would have to say that almost everybody seemed receptive to this idea, maybe not in this specific act or form, but yet know that virtual meetings are here to stay. And everybody's had a virtual doctor appointment over the last year, and they know that they can get benefit from it. So why should we stop it or limit its access in the future? It needs to be open to everybody. So those were kind of the three main legislative pieces that we talked about. And even we've had some feedback today that we've had some success based on the CONNECT Act that I just referenced with Congresswoman Herrera Butler's office. So that's kind of shocking that 2 days later you would get some feedback, but again, that's why you got to do it, and you got to be out there and banging the drum, waving the flag. That's not something that was typically comfortable for me doing, but you got to do it because you just, nobody else is. So you got it. I mean, nobody in a general sense. I mean, obviously the chapter, other ALS organizations are pushing hard for us, but again, we're a small number. So but we can be loud, and
Yeah.
and that's what I think we need to do. So.
Thanks, Ian. I think that's such a good point of a small number, but just being consistent and loud and maybe getting out of your comfort zone and participating in these sorts of things makes a big difference. I know with some of the people who've participated in the past, like Jerry and Sam Beekman, right, Lance, and a few other people, they have continued to be advocates and have been really inspired by how they made a difference. Lance or Ian, do either of you have the answer for this? Are these all new legislative asks for 2022?
So we are in a new Congress, so that started in January of this year. And so how it works sort of is any bill from the past that didn't pass in the previous Congress goes away and everything gets submitted anew. And so often with the same sponsors or co-sponsors, but sometimes with new co-sponsors, we also may edit some of the language within bills. The Promising Pathways and the Act for ALS Act were present in the last Congress, but didn't get a lot of traction. And they were resubmitted earlier this year. And, I think the big push is to really focus on those. And as Ian said, I think some form of continuation of telehealth, whether this bill or some other, I think will happen. But of course, we're here for ALS. That's what we really care about. And I want to share that Ian is humble, but he also very effectively conveyed on his own behalf and for others the intensity and the speed in which ALS can move, and the limited time that people have to be advocates and be effective. And occasionally when we got a little bit of pushback, he gently but firmly reminded some of these staffers of the nature of ALS, and I think it made a big difference.
I'm not sure gently is the right word, but I appreciate that nonetheless.
Well, now that you're pretty fired up, Ian, it sounds like, how are you hoping to stay involved? Of course, on the board, but if you could talk maybe a little bit about how you're hoping to continue, some of this work in the future, if you thought about it.
I'd love to continue doing like what I did this year, again, being able to do it again next year. We have such a limited time meeting with with these staffers or with the offices, but again, more people, if somebody out there wants to get involved, a person with it that maybe didn't feel like they could be comfortable doing it, you got something to say. So again, just don't. Again, it wasn't something I was looking to do or felt I would be good at, but I was given the opportunity, and I'd like to keep doing it and keep doing it for as long as I can. But you don't have to. I mean, you can do it locally. You can do it in your community, whatever to the extent of your comfort level is. I'm a little. Besides what Lance said, I'm usually a little more reserved and with my opinion or other things. So, but you just, again, maybe get outside your comfort zone as much as you can, but just and as big of a circle as you want to be in. But just try to do it. But yeah, if there's somebody else out there listening thinks, yeah, I'd like to be a part of that, by all means, reach out to the chapter, and we'll take it, definitely. But no, I'd love to do it again and maybe be involved in other aspects similar to that. So no, it was overall, it was a very positive experience. I mean, these things move slow, which time is not something we have, but it's like a relay race. I mean, you run your leg and you hand off the baton to somebody else, and you keep going, and the goal is to get to the finish line. So if not today for somebody, maybe tomorrow, or maybe in the future.
Well, it's very well said, Ian. And we've gotten a few comments of people saying that it sounds like you know your stuff really well. So for being new to public policy and these kinds of asks, it sounds like you've really gone all in, which is important. Lance, I know things are a lot different now. In the past, you've done face-to-face visits here in Oregon and Portland with people living with ALS, but how can people get involved now that things are a bit different and a lot more virtual and things like that?
Sure. Well, as Ian said, we're in this for the long haul. And Ian, I think what you said about the relay is profound. And but our whole community is touched by this disease, all the family caregivers, all the friends and community members, and all those voices make a difference, particularly to politicians. They really do care. It sounds trite, but they do care about what their constituents think. And if you are their voter, they pay attention. And so, we certainly hope to have sort of face-to-face advocacy again and have delegations in Washington, D.C. But also in the last several years in the summer, when legislators are home in their districts, we've been doing district meetings with them in their offices locally. In addition, prior to COVID, we were really ramping up and being active with advocacy at the state capitol. We have some great champions within the state legislature who have ALS connections, who helped us get a bill passed and supported a bill to make ALS Awareness Month in perpetuity. But there's things, of course, on the state level that we need to do to make sure that people have access to support and services. So we hope to be back in the state capitol again and meeting with state legislators. Certainly one way to get involved is to go to the Advocacy Action Center that Stephanie referenced and I put in the chat and sign up. And what happens is if there is something that's moving, particularly in Washington, D.C., and it makes a difference when something is getting ready to go for a vote or it's going to be attached to a bill, they will send out action alerts and ask you to email or call your Congress members. And it makes a difference. It really does. We have a lot of great champions on Capitol Hill. We have a lot of great champions here in the state. Many legislators have close personal connections with ALS. Our state treasurer, Tobias Reed, who is a great supporter of the chapter and an advisory board member for our chapter, his father passed away with ALS, and we supported him on his journey. And he's a tireless champion for us. So, on all levels, grassroots to, the walking the halls of the state capitol or the Congress, it can make a difference. But don't underestimate writing that letter or picking up the phone or sending an email. And then, gosh, I've got to get up to speed with modern technology. Tweeting and Facebook posts, name the members with their specific Twitter accounts. All these legislators in the state and in particularly Capitol Hill, they all have interns and staffers who are monitoring their social media accounts nonstop, and they take note and they document all that stuff. So if you tweet to your congressman or congresswoman, they see it, they know it.
Yeah, thank you, Lance. And I would agree with the Twitter presence as well. And around this month, we also kind of have a stronger Twitter presence as well. Feel free to retweet some of ours, but also definitely, just get a Twitter account if you don't have one, because it's like one of the strongest ways to approach your representatives in kind of the social media sphere. I'll include in the comments a link to our public policy priorities and that advocacy center that Lance mentioned, which is really easy to sign up. And I'm a part of it. Lance is, I'm sure Ian is, and to contact your local representatives. They make it super easy. But thank you so much, Lance. And of course, Ian, we really appreciate you being involved, being on the board, and jumping in for the advocacy conference as well. It makes such a difference, and it sounds like you really enjoyed it. So thanks everyone for joining us. We'll be back next month, I'm sure, with probably a research-focused topic. But thank you, Ian, and thank you, Lance.
All right, thank you, Stephanie.
Bye-bye.